And all right, the call should go out. And we are live right now. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Comic Artist Pro Secrets. My name's Ethan Van Sciver. And boy, it's totally awesome to have you here tonight. I think you're going to be glad that you did show up. I think you're going to remember this day for all of your life as a comic book fan. This is the day, this is the night where you got to meet one of the premier artists of Batman, one of the greatest and most original artists of Batman that I think has ever lived. I mean, when you see his Batman art, you know it's him right away. He has a very beautiful, stylized look to his work. And he has drawn some of the most important and best remembered issues of Batman especially of the early '90s, I would say. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to Mr. Kelley Jones. You have to talk to show up on the screen.
Okay.
There he is.
No, thank you very much. That's nice to hear all that stuff. You don't really think of it while you're doing that. You know that, Ethan. When you do them, you don't know. You're just happy. You're just happy you get to do it.
Yeah, when you're in the process of working on a book, I mean, everything that you're doing, you're hoping is going to be a big, gigantic, enormous success that people remember forever. But that's not always the case, and
Nope.
oftentimes,
Nope.
Some luck is involved. But all right, let me see here. Let me pull up the chat. Sorry, okay. So I'll be able to see everyone's questions. Okay, everyone, here's what's going to happen now. I'm going to interview Mr. Jones. And the way it's going to work is, I think, Kelley, are you prepared to draw? Are you going to be able to draw on screen?
Right behind me.
Oh, I love it. Terrific. All right,
Yeah.
so we're going to do an interview. We're going to find out all about Kelley Jones's career. He's going to do a live Batman drawing demo, so you guys will probably be able to follow along. Kelley is a little bit of a teacher too. I watched one of his. I think so. I mean, I watched your chat on YouTube, your YouTube video, and yeah, you could have been a teacher. I think you have a very instructorly manner about you. So this might be really, really neat.
Considering how poorly I did with teachers, that's nice to hear, actually.
All right, so and then after that, we're going to turn it over to a Q&A. So you guys are going to be able to ask questions, and I will relay questions as long as they're polite and interesting. I'm sure they're all going to be polite. You're not exactly a controversial figure, Kelley.
No, I don't think so.
All right, so
the long ears have caused me a lot of consternation over years.
Maybe we'll get okay. So so that's the way it's going to work. So guys, you can ask questions, but please or talk among yourselves. I'll be kind of keeping an eye on the chat, but please save your important questions. And I know many people have questions that they've been dying to ask. Please save them until the end. I'll ask for them, and then you guys can kind of lay them on me, and I will make sure to eat up as much of Kelley Jones's night as possible with them.
You can.
All right, so let's talk about your childhood in Sacramento.
Well, I was kind of lucky in that I had parents that, though very blue collar, were encouraging of all this. Not just the drawing, that was just sort of always there, but the love of comic books, getting comic books, collecting comic books, watching horror films, going to drive-ins then and whatnot. They had no problem with it. And their only rule was that if I was going to watch something scary on television, I couldn't come running into their room screaming in the night. I had to deal with it. If I was going to buy comics, just mow a lot of lawns, And at that time I was lucky, my brother just started driving, and part of his deal was he had to take me everywhere to all the 7-Elevens, but since I was into that, they really encouraged me collecting them, and they had no problem with it. I to this day wonder why they let me do it.
Well, when did you see your first comic book? How did that come about?
My brother came home from school. It was at the end of a school year, and one of his classes, he must have been in 6th or 7th, 8th grade, something like that. And they just had comic books in there, and the teacher sent him home with comics. And it was Fantastic Four 84. and it was with Maximus fighting from the Inhumans, and it rocked my world. And I had never seen anything like that, and so that really got me. And at that time, you know, I would pick them up here and there at like grocery stores or at a convenience market. You'd see them there, so I never got them in continuity. But in those days, comics, if you remember, were like one and dones. You know, they were just one story, so I didn't really know the characters. I just knew it. It wasn't until, of all things, Marvel Comics in 1966, so it went into syndication, had put a lot of their comics in cartoon form.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were run like when you came home from school. Man, I raced home from school because they had, you know, Thor and the Submariner and Iron Man, all these things. They were all Jack Kirby and Don Heck drawings, and
Yeah,
they would
with the
move
great
them
theme
around.
songs. Yeah.
Yeah, so my that's where I saw them in continuity and got to know who they were.
Mm-hmm.
And I was transfixed by this. And Thor in particular just knocked me out. So I still did not know the names of anybody who did comics. I didn't even know how they did anything. It wasn't until my parents were invited to stay at a friend of theirs' cabin in North Lake Tahoe. It was in middle of winter, snowing like crazy. They did not want their son reading comics. So while we were taking the place for the weekend, they said, just have your son take these because they're bad influence on their son. And in there was Swamp Thing #2.
Ooh.
There was Swamp Thing #2, Frankenstein #5, and tons of regular like Avengers, Fantastic Four, and all that stuff. And I really enjoyed those. I hated Swamp Thing #2 when I saw it. Hated it. Hated Frankenstein #5 because they scared the hell out of me. And I went back about an hour or so after I read them again, and I became an instant fan. And that's the first book that I looked to see who made it. You know, I actually read the credits box, and I saw these weird names of Ween and Wrightson. They seem like the kind of guys, that's the name you have to have if you're going to do Swamp Thing. And I became, at that point, a collector of comics, not just a fan who would occasionally pick them up. At that point, I knew I had to buy them. And started from there. So that's whenever Swamp Thing #2 came out, you know, 72, 73, something like that. I was a little kid, but I was the only one in those days buying comic books and reading them. I had no friends to talk to about this stuff until long after. So I knew, and probably that's why my parents knew I was very passionate about it, because it didn't matter to me. You know, I'd go play baseball, I'd do all that stuff, but there was always that time where I had to go buy the comics, get to know the people who ran 7-Eleven so I knew when they were coming, and followed these things, you know?
How about Bernie Wrightson being one of your formative influences? I mean,
he scared the hell out of me. And not very often do you have a visceral effect as a kid. And I would look at the Unmen, or how he did, you know, how he just drew people in lighting, that the light really affected them, that the atmosphere, the backgrounds were every bit as important as his figures. And I believed his world. So these images stay in your head. It was the good kind of scare you, though. It was the kind where you'd go back and look and find a new thing every time. I still do. And at that point, it affected me pretty deeply. As I got older, I realized how skilled he was at composition, how skilled he was at his inking, how he could texture so well, his very strong dramatic sense. Those things came later, but they still work on you whether you understand that or not, you know.
so this was in the early 70s, and you were what, 10, 11 years old?
10, 11 years old, yeah. And like I said, you know, the Hey Kids comics rack was my comic book store, wherever you could find them. And hunting those things down was tough. I'll tell you, when you'd get Howard the Duck 2, miss 3, and find 4, it would drive you nuts. You know, like you had to.
Yeah.
at that point, I had to just give my brother money for gas and go hunt for these things. Luckily, he understood I was insane, so he went along with it.
All right, so what kind of kid now being 10 years old and finding Bernie Wrightson? I mean, you were allowed to watch horror movies, but I don't know if you were a big horror fan. Did you start tuning into the Creature double feature kind of Saturday afternoon?
I think what happened was I was a fan of that stuff before I was really of comics, because I had seen at like 6 or 7 years old, I saw Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein on television back to back. And I was absolutely terrified. But it struck me because at the end of it, when it was all said and done, I felt sorry for him. And even then, I remember telling my father, you know, how terrifying it was, but I really felt sorry for him that they'd done him wrong. And so at that moment, I became interested in that kind of stuff. You know, you did all the other stuff other kids did, but what really happened, Ethan, was I was allowed to watch these things. So when I would watch Kolchak, the Night Stalker, or one of these things on television that none of the other kids were allowed to watch, I'd go to school the next day and tell them what had happened. So they would all come to me and say, well, what happened? Because they weren't allowed to watch this stuff. And that's where I really started becoming a storyteller. Was I would say, you know, and the vampire guy came out of the weeds and attacked somebody, and all you saw were his eyes, and he sucked their blood, and he said, and they're freaking out. I mean, I had a teacher say, you're scaring the other kids by telling them these things that were on television. And that's powerful. When you're a kid, that's pretty powerful. But it was one of those things that I was grateful for it, you know.
Did you believe in ghosts, monsters as a kid?
I think I believed in the possibility of it. I mean, your rational part, even as a kid, knows now there can't be, because, you know, mom and dad wouldn't, you know, they'd arm you. You know, they would have a ghost gun or something, and they didn't. So, but there's that part of you that says, well, maybe, you know, maybe there is something to it. Luckily, I've never, you know, I'm open to it. I've not had anything like that happen before. I'm pretty much a big coward anyway, so I used to close my eyes at the really scary points of horror films. I probably still do, but that's where you get it out on paper, you know.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, did you? So was it? It was you were going to be a comic book artist. There was no point that you decided you might go into movies or anything like that. What made it comics?
Ethan, I never thought of it as a career until I met Marshall Rogers, and that was just as a fan. I was a big fan of comics, and I would draw a lot, but I would draw a lot of different things, and I didn't really understand the fundamental how you did a comic book then. There was no real teaching for it. I just drew a lot, and I read a lot, and I was into films, and I might have got into that. I was probably more interested in getting into history and things like that, because I didn't know there was a career in this. I had no idea. And so in going to a convention in San Francisco, a friend of mine by the name of Jim Sinclair, who did some work with Sam Keith, had brought my art without me knowing. He brought some of my art to show Marshall Rogers, because I was a big fan of Marshall Rogers' Batman then. And I just went there to have him sign some books, and I was going to go wander around, go see Jim Steranko, you know, like you do. And Marshall was just savaging some guy before me, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm so glad I didn't bring my stuff. And my buddy pulls out this stuff, and he says, look, my friend doesn't think he can do this, but I think he's good. What do you think? I could have killed him then and there for this. And I'm like 16, 17 years old, or 16, I guess. And I just, all of a sudden, all my fun went to terror. I thought I was going to throw up. And Marshall looks at it and says nothing for like a minute or so. He's just going through it. And he looks up at me and he says, do you have some time? And I said, yeah.
That's nice.
Do you want to sit down for a minute? Because I think you can do this. I think you're pretty good. I had no superhero art. I was just all my weird drawings. There was a few moments that looked like comics, but they weren't, you know, superheroes or anything. And then he began to tell me how to do this. In fact, let me show you something here. I got to show you this. I didn't know you were going to ask me this.
So I always ask the good questions that lead to the props coming out.
So he sits down and he starts telling me everything I'm doing right. Everything he likes. It's original. It's all this kind of stuff. He tells me, fix it here, do this here, work on that, that kind of stuff. But he's really taking me aside. This is after I've seen him just destroy some people. And he's nice about it. He's not mean. He's just, you got to
He's
do
honest.
this. Yeah, he's very honest, but not what you'd want to hear. So he takes out a piece of paper and he draws this for me. And if you can see, it's how to draw a figure. And here's, how to draw the figure, how to do an arm, how to lay out a head. And I'm like, wow. I mean, I'm sitting next to him. There's now a big crowd of people around because they're fascinated. Then he took this page out he drew, which is from Detective 481. And in it, he takes this page and he shows me, look at the motion. All the motion is in the figure swinging a trunk. He goes through how everything on storytelling. Making Batman dominate in this figure and the cape and the whole. They have wonderful stuff, just wonderful stuff here. Okay, I had no money then for this. It was about a year or two ago. A buddy of mine, he had heard me tell this story so many times, he found it and bought it for me.
Oh wow, that's terrific!
But this is the actual page he was doing this when I was a kid.
Wonderful.
So at that moment, he finishes up by saying, one day, and he was very serious. He goes, one day I see you doing a really great Batman. So if you keep at this, you'll do that. Now, that didn't make me say I want to go draw Batman. I was so stunned that I don't remember the rest of the show. And I remember driving home, and it went from I wanted to kill my friend Jim to thank you, And that's when I first thought, well, maybe I could do this. Maybe.
Now, how old were you?
At that point, I have to say I was a freshman going to being a sophomore that summer. So whatever, 14, 15 to 16.
In high school. Oh, I thought you meant college.
No, I was a pretty young punk. But he liked my drawing a lot. He thought what I did, if I remember, he had said it looked like I was speaking to him personally through a style. That was like a personal thing. And he really dug that. I had no idea what that meant until long later. I didn't know how to take that. He probably because I didn't look like anybody at that time too much because I was not trained and I hadn't studied anything, and he could clearly tell that. That's why he showed me how to do things. I was just looking at people and wondering how to put them in a comic book or put them in a drawing or whatever. So at that point, I started to take it a lot more seriously. And in about 3 years later, Marvel did a tryout. And I sent stuff to DC and I sent stuff to Marvel at that time. And again, this is so strange. The day I get hired was the day I was rejected, on the same day, where I get this very detailed thing from Ernie Cullen at DC saying I suck. But it was nicely said, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. If he did say, if you live near here, but you're out in California, if you live near here, maybe I would ask you to come in and I could help you with stuff, but you're just too far away from it. But at the same day, the same amount, 2 hours later, I get this thing from Marvel saying, Butch Geist wants you to ink Micronauts for him. And would you accept the job? And it was on the same day. I had sent them the same stuff to look at. And it was, I think, 2 days before Halloween, 2 or 3 days before Halloween. So, of course, I said yes. In all honesty, I agreed with what DC said more than what Marvel said. I agreed with what DC was saying critique-wise.
Yeah.
So I wasn't heart destroyed or that way. I just went, well, yeah, I'm going to have to do that. 2 hours later, this FedEx comes from Marvel, or it wasn't FedEx, but it was some kind of like a UPS thing. And it said from Ralph Macchio that Butch Guy saw your stuff. He'd like you to be the inker. And I that's how I started. And about a year or so after that, Jackson quit. When Butch decided he wanted to go on to do other things, they said, "Do you want to pencil it? We've looked around. We don't really like what we see." I said, "I'm not really a penciler. I didn't think I could draw, but I didn't know if I could handle a monthly." And they said, "We'll talk you through it. Don't worry about it." And I said, "No, I really don't think I can do that, because it's like, a monthly is a significant commitment of your life. You know, and in those days, it took me all day to draw something." And Ralph Macchio and Bob Harris would not take no for an answer. They said, "If you screw up, it's on us, but we're sending you a script and off you go." And that's, at that point, Marvel was very good at teaching. And I owe those guys a lot, because they talked me off the roof, as it were.
They saw you, though. They saw the talent in you. And so this is 1983 we're talking about here. This is Micronauts. 52 was your first thinking work. 59 was your first penciling work.
Yep.
So everybody else was rocking out to Michael Jackson's Thriller, including me. I'm in the third grade.
Right.
And you are a young man, a very young man.
Yes.
Working at Marvel Comics now, drawing Micronauts. So did you know the characters? Were you aware of the toys?
I was a gigantic fan of the book. And so it was a shock. It would have been, there was obviously everyone loved the X-Men, and I did, and there was several books I really loved, and Micronauts under Mike Golden. I loved Michael Golden's work on that with Joe Rubenstein. So yeah, that was a big fan of it. I loved when Butch took over the book. I became a big fan of his. I love Pat Broderick on it. So yeah, I was a big fan. I never saw myself in that category. I was just too young. I didn't have any training, and I knew that, and I hope for the best, But I was so excited to do it. That first month was adrenaline, just sheer adrenaline. And they hired me a good inker in Bruce Patterson, who really nursemaided me through. And they were all really great guys. I do owe them a lot, because they would get on the phone with me and say, "Here's what's working, here's what's not working, let's try to do this." Very encouraging the whole time. I can look back on those and only wince half as much as I used to, because I do see there's something there. I don't know about you, but I couldn't see. I was more happy that I got to spend a day doing what I wanted, rather than having to go to a regular job. But I didn't see any great talent there. I just knew what I wanted. And some days you get it and some days you don't. And I was always ready to accept that criticism, because I didn't know anybody else who did it. I had nobody. So
were there any conventions, like comic conventions, that you might have gone to meet any pros?
There were, but I was in Sacramento then, and they didn't do them in Sacramento. So to go to one was like a 2.5-hour drive to San Francisco. And when they would do them, I went to a few. And I remember at that point, Butch Guice came out to one, so we could sit and talk for a while, and that helped me a lot. But I didn't know any of these people, and I didn't even know how to approach them, and they had no idea who I was. So
what did Butch say to you? What was the kind of guidance he was giving you?
Butch told me that he thought we made a great team, and he thought that I brought a real nice organic style to it. And I remember the thing that I really liked was he said that he really liked how I laid down blacks. That it was very, very comic book to him, and that's what he wanted. He was a very high contrast guy, as if you know Butch's stuff, it is. I didn't know.
And that advice stuck with you, because that's still one of the main features of your work, I think, is just, a very confident use of dark shadows and blacks to, accentuate.
Well, I always felt it made an impressive, that one of the things they taught me at Marvel, and it was a great shorthand system. They said at that time, 22 pages a month is a lot, but if you break it down to just try to get one really great panel per page. And if you can get one really great panel per page, that might lift up some of the others, but just worry about one. And if you can do that and do that on every page, that's 22 great panels in a book. That's really hard to do.
They call those anchor panels. I think I heard that from
Right.
Dan Jurgens. They're called anchor
Right.
panels, and the main panel on a page that your eye goes to, and everything else kind of orbits around it. It's a very late '80s, early '90s kind of approach to doing a comic book, page.
And he might have heard this. I heard this from Ralph Macchio and Bob Harris and those guys. So then at that point, and to me, the panels that really were strong were the ones that had very strong graphic sense to it, the lighting or whatever. But that really helped me. That their way of thinking was great shorthand. All they were doing was making me not obsess over every single little line, every little panel. And they knew there were a lot of guys walking in there, and they knew what they were doing already. With me, it was like they were teaching me perspective. They were teaching me foreground, midground stuff. Background, really, really good stuff. They always felt, well. I think it was Ralph says, if you were a pitcher, I see you as a pitcher who can throw 100 miles an hour. So I'll work on the finer points, because it's hard to find someone who can throw 100 miles an hour. And I that I understood. So I went, okay, you do begin to get a little confidence, at least that you should be there. It was later on when I went to DC, though, and that was about 5 or 6 years later. I had gotten pretty tired of being at Marvel, only because I wasn't allowed to. When I would try to do some of the stuff that I was developing into, it would be inked like more traditionally, and they were avoiding a lot of my heavy-handedness, a lot of the heavy blacks and stuff like that. So, out of the blue, DC called, said, "Would you like to come over here and try there's a few things we see that we think you might be good for." When I went there, it was exactly not what I wanted to do, but out of the blue, they gave me Deadman in Action Comics. And nobody cared about Deadman then, other than Neil. Yeah, other than Neil Adams,
Yeah. That's the kind of situation you want to be in. You want to be given a character that not a lot of people are looking at, that you have a vision for, and you clearly did have a vision for this character, Deadman, so you could make him your own, and nobody would be hovering over you.
Well, and yeah, nobody cared. They just wanted it in on time because they had to keep a copyright, right? Every so often, you got to put out you got to put the character out. And all I saw was there's Neil Adams' version, and then everyone doing a version of Neil Adams' version. And it was very tough to compete with that. You don't compete with that. So I just took the name literally and went in a direction that I figured they'll either hate it or they'll like it, but no one will say it was a version of like Neil's. And I was very grateful because they let me do that. And when it went over pretty well. I didn't know it, but it was the first time I really got reaction from other creators, where I would hear from, like, that's where I met John Beatty. John Beatty was in the office, and he was doing Superman or whatever he was doing, and he had seen these pages, and he said, "Man, I'd like to ink that." And at that time, John had to have been in the top 5 inkers working. There's, Austin, Jansen, Rubenstein, those kind of guys. And certainly John. And I would hear from other artists were thinking that this was different. It was interesting. And so when they offered me Deadman in a Prestige, I arrogantly said, only if I ink it. Because that's what I really wanted to do, was put the two together now. And I thought they'd say no, and I'd have to argue. But Richard Bruning, the editor, said, go ahead. You know, go to town. Look, I was lucky. When I got to Dead Man, I had an editor, Barbara Kiesel, who hired me initially, didn't like my stuff too much. She was into more mainstream, very clear mainstream stuff, but she loved that I was doing something different. And to have an editor who you know isn't really a particular fan of your aesthetic, but pushes you to go further is a treasure.
That's special,
So
yeah.
yeah, and so I would say, well, what do you think? And she says, it's not anything I think I would really be attracted to, but I'm going to tell you right now, my only advice is go further with it. I think you're still restraining yourself. Go further. You need to go further. And I did. The thing took off, like I said, for a little 8-pager. And when they offered me the Prestige series, it was a perfect storm because they said you get to pencil and ink it, and it's due in a year. We'll see you then. You know, so I got to be left alone to my own devices, and I didn't turn in. It was a 48-page book. I was so afraid they were going to stop me, even with all these very complimentary words. I didn't show them anything till I had it, the first one practically done. And they finally said, "Are you working on this at all?" I said, "Yeah, I'm doing fine." "Well, can we see something?" Yeah. I'll get it to you. But I figured I had to do so much that it would overwhelm them. You know, I've always never been, I have not been openly a confident guy. I'm privately in my studio, I'm fine. Oh, I love this. They're going to love this. When I show it, I go, oh, they're going to hate it. Because it is not in the self-aggrandizing sense, but it's personal. And so when they liked it, I waited for the shoe to drop, and the shoe didn't drop. They just said, well, here's the next script. Mike Barron's written the next script. This will finish it, and who do you want to color it, what that kind of stuff. And I said, well, whoever you think. I mean, I had no idea. I was just okay. And they went and got the absolute genius of Les Dorscheid, and it all comes, that's where you are right about the lucky thing, because
Yeah.
Les Dorscheid taught me lighting in a different way. He would say, he got a hold of me and he said, there's outdoor lighting and indoor lighting. And I hadn't thought of that before. The artificial lighting of indoors and then the natural light of outdoors. Wonderful ideas like that. So that started affecting me. And in those days, they hand watercolored. You know, they didn't do it on computer. So I would get these beautiful, beautiful original watercolor paintings over my stuff. I think every artist should have that once. Someone who can watercolor their stuff like that.
That'd be wonderful. I would love to
It
see
is.
that happen.
It's a stunning thing.
Well,
So
let me ask you kind of a more kind of personal question about this. So are you saying that you did a 48-page Dead Man book and it took a year?
no, it was two 48-page books that I penciled and inked. So
In a year.
yeah, so you go, well, they gave me about 9-10 months. So you go 48 times 4, right? Because I got to ink them. So it was a pretty good, they gave me a great contract on it, no pressure deadline wise. They did not think much would come of it. They just originally, in fact, it was to be for another artist who had become ill and couldn't do it. So it was just all perfect timing. And after I finished the book, the first book, I think then I knew, okay, I'm onto something. When I got finished with the second, that's when DC said, would you like to work here permanently?
Yes, of course. Of
Yeah.
course. That's great.
We have some other stuff. And that's when I think they gave me a Swamp Thing. And then I went on to Sandman for a while. I was getting a lot of calls to do that kind of material. There were no horror books then.
Well, there was one big one.
Just Swamp Thing.
No. Beyond that, I mean, we'll get to that. You were about to be. I consider Batman to be a horror book, especially when you draw it.
Yes. Yes.
Did you have a family at this point? You're still a young man.
I was, at the time I was doing Dead Man, I was single, and
Oh, thank God.
right, and it was because I just worked I was working, totally focused on that. But from 1990 on, I've been married. So, at that point, I was able to. I obviously, when kids come along, you understand kids come
Yeah.
along. You gotta pick your spots then when to do it.
But I mean, it's good because people need to understand. I talk to people who are in like 45 years old and thinking about finally breaking into comics, and I'm just like, and they have families. I mean, you really do need to get all of your like grunt work, like all of your big, ambitious, like your most ballsy work almost out of your system when you're young, because you have a family eventually that is going to depend on you, and you're going to need to work at a quicker pace.
Well,
But
you're right. You're right. I wanted to do. I called it the work that when they fire me for this job, I always think when I'm fired, well, at least I will have a book to show everyone this is what I meant. They fired me for the right reasons, but I love this book and this is how I look.
did you
I
think
thought,
of everything that you were doing as, okay, this is going to be, this is my Sergeant Pepper, this is my Killing Joke, this is
yep,
my masterpiece?
yeah, well, yeah, and down to the fact that when I took Dead Man, I had the distinct honor of Neil Adams coming up to me and saying, "You solved the problem of not drawing like me. You know, you did it." He says, "That's how you do it." And you know Neil, so that was a very cool thing he said, because that was his guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when I went on and I did like when I did Sandman, I had no idea. Sam Keith was a friend of mine, and he had done the first few issues, and I didn't really know much about it. So when I got to do that, it was a similar thing. I always had a thing with writers that I like to talk the story over before they write it. And not so much that I throw my 2 cents in, but to really get the vibe going. And when I first, like with Neil, he says, "Well, I kind of just sort of write." And the first one he did, and he said, "I said, I know, but I like the give and take. You never know what will come out of that. A third thing comes out of it. It's yours and mine. But then that third thing." And that's kind of what happened with Sandman. And then Sandman was taking off on its own anyway. So,
What was your
and
relationship like with Neil Gaiman?
always very good. We used to talk a lot in the middle of the night. At that point, he was still living in England, and he didn't know how things were going over here. So I'd say, "Hey, you know, uh, book I remember the one with the cats I did extremely well, and he was worried about that. He says at that point he was very, very blocked, and he couldn't think of a story. So he decided, and I think he solved it well. He says, "I just won't write about Sandman. I'll write something else." And so Sandman's not really even in the book. It's just about cats who dream. It was a great solution to his writer's block. And I had only done the previous issue, and I was out of there. I was going to go off to do something else, and they couldn't find an art. It's the story of my life. They couldn't find an artist for it because nobody wanted to draw a book of just cats. 4 or 5 very notable people turned it down. So when he called me, he says, "Everybody's turning this down." He named who they were. I went, "Wow, those are all great people. I'll take it." If they turned it down, I got it. That's where my ballsy thing was. Well, then if they're going to say no, I got to do it.
And I'll show them how they were supposed to do it. I'll show them the opportunity they
you
missed.
know what? I can do 22 pages of cats. All right, I'll do that because why not?
Sure.
I had a cat at that time. I put that poor animal through its paces by posing him around and making him do everything. I dedicated the book to him when they reprinted it, because that poor cat had to go through hell. But that was a smash hit, right? And it's the one that everyone remembers. And I always told Neil, we were doing a signing, I said, "Look, I take all the credit for this one, man, because I threw myself and bled for this to make these damn cats right, you know."
Which book was this? Because people in the chat are probably going to want to go buy
Dream
it.
of a Thousand Cats.
Dream of a Thousand Cats, Sandman?
Yeah.
Beautiful. So you're
issue 18, I think.
okay.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go check it out because I'd never seen that. But that's the kind of thing I would love to do too. It just seems so offbeat.
Yeah, well, it's a challenge, right? when
Hmm.
somebody, when maybe if they just came to me, Ethan, to be fair, if they just came to me and said, hey, here's a story of cats, I might have said no. When I was told that basically some pretty star people had turned it down, um, I that was like catnip. I had to do it. I had to do it.
So were you talking with other Sandman artists like Sam Keith? I mean, were you you must have been friends with Sam. You guys
Yeah,
are.
Sam and I knew each other from high school.
Oh, I didn't
So
know that.
yeah, we knew each other from high school, and we had a mutual friend who we thought was just incredibly talented, who really never wanted, faded off, and remained friends. And so we both were solving similar problems at the same time. He was always trying to be perfect with his line work, and I remember him coming over one day, and he said, I can't, because he was a big fan of Dave Stevens. And I had said, yeah, I am too. I'm a fan of that. But we both love Wrightson. I said, Wrightson has perfect lines. Some are big, some are small. They don't all line up the same, and they achieve this thing. And so we both sort of in my kitchen figured this out. And then we both went kind of at the same time that epiphany happened. Uh, and so he was telling me he did like the first 4 or 5 issues of Sandman. And when I came to it was about a year later. And like I said, the book was culty, but it hadn't really taken off. I think the Season of Mist storyline is where it really took off. And then it became like an X-Men thing. But and they had offered me that as a regular monthly, but that's when Batman came. It was like,
Yeah.
I got to take Batman.
So let's talk about, is it Doug Mensch? How do you pronounce
Doug
that?
Mensch. Doug Mensch.
Mensch. Okay. So let's talk about him. Um, you know where I know him from? Am I thinking of the same guy? Didn't he write the Big Book of Conspiracies? Wasn't he?
Yes, yes, yes. Doug had a library of UFOs and Bigfoots and Kennedy assassination and all that stuff. His whole house is a library. I
Yeah.
mean, of all subjects and stuff. But he knew of where he spoke. And while I was doing Sandman, the inker on it was Malcolm Jones, and he was friends with Doug. And Doug had seen Dead Man, and now Doug was seeing some of the art I was doing for Sandman, and that's when Doug called me up, and that was amazing because I was a big fan. He wrote Master Kung Fu, and geez, from Master Kung Fu to Godzilla, right? And I was a fan of all this stuff.
Hmm.
I mean, at least when I was a kid growing up. So when he called, he says, hey, I got this idea for Batman, and it's just, kind of nuts, but how about if I send you the treatment, and if you like it, I'll approach Denny O'Neil. And I was all excited. Wow, Batman. And at that point, he sends it. Uh, I read the title, and I was like, ew, this is terrible. Batman versus Dracula. Ew. Right? I was thinking Batman and the Penguin, or something typical, normal. But when I read the treatment, and then it wasn't called Red Rain, it was called Glory and Scarlet or something like that. And about halfway through reading it, I called him up, and I said, okay, I'm on, because this is fabulous. And he goes, well, what do you think? And I said, I don't know, I'm halfway through, but this is really good.
Mm.
And it's different from what I thought it was going to be. And there's a very true Gothic tragedy to this thing. I thought it was going to be stupid. And I said, the title doesn't grab me, but I do like this. And he called me about a half hour later saying, okay, Denny O'Neil's approved it, because he knew Denny pretty well. And he says, once I got a commitment from you, will you do it? And I said, absolutely. So I had to call Karen Berger and say, I can't take Sandman on regularly because Red Rain had come up, and they were very disappointed, which, I wasn't used to people when I quit being disappointed when I quit. So and again, Ethan, I was given like, okay, it's a graphic novel, it's 90 pages, you got several months to get it done. And
I
I was
love
just
that.
yeah, I was just left alone to do it.
You know, our careers are following the same path. I'm
Yeah.
listening to you and I'm saying, first of all, yeah, there were three guys that were artists with me, and one of them, the one we thought was going to succeed, kind of was obsessed with lines, and he turned out to, I think now he's cleaning up roadkill in Elkhart,
Yeah.
Indiana. It's so
Yeah.
weird. And then
Yeah.
like the stranger, more eccentric artist, Sam Keith for you,
Yeah.
was Trent Kanuga for me.
Yeah.
And I did I spent a year doing two 48-page books that I inked for the first time.
Yeah.
Um, Amazing. I don't know. We're brothers. We're
I
brothers
think
in a lot of ways.
I think there's, but you know what? It's because I think that I never was, I was never put in the position like you're the guy that we're gonna put everything. You know, my friends were very nice to me, but they didn't say, "Oh yeah, you're great." It was just the other people, and I was in agreement with them when I went to and worked at comics. It was when I got in, it was for technical things, but it was never like, "Oh, you're this guy." It's when that personal vision started coming out, and I realized then that people can be technically a lot better than me, but they can't think like me, and
So true.
that's where you succeed. Is that if you can think of something, you don't have to look and say, "Oh, geez, I can't draw like John Buscema. I can't draw perfectly like Alex Ross." That's okay. In fact, you can do things that might influence them. You can do things that are so personal because you see this very powerful image. When I got to Batman, uh, the first thing I told Doug was, I don't see him the way other people see him. I said I see it like a film noir thing, a horror film noir type of thing. And he goes, "Well, explain that to me. Just don't say that." And I said, "Well, okay. His thing is to scare people. Yet I don't see that in any of the books. He just beats the hell out of people."
Yes, that's exactly right. Okay,
Yeah.
now we're talking. Let's
Okay.
talk
And I
about
said,
Batman.
okay. So I said, what I see him doing is he basically, if he has to beat you, he's kind of failed at that point. Basically, all he does is say, "Stop it."
Hmm.
And the way he says it, the way he holds himself, that is enough.
His first
That's
weapon is intimidation and
and
fear and superstition.
and the reason you know the rogues gallery are insane to a man is they keep doing it again.
Yeah.
Regular people, once he comes to regular people, regular criminals, they quit. That's why Batman is. I told Doug, I said, to me, the reason Gordon works with him and breaks your Fourth Amendment rights is there's no recidivism with regular criminals when Batman's there. Gotham, he can go to a gang and say, "Stop it," they stop it. The Joker keeps doing it because he's insane. The Penguin keeps doing it. They're all off. But regular criminals don't go to Arkham Asylum. Regular criminals do their time and never do it again because of him. Batman's the guy in the room with you 10 minutes before you realize he's been in the room with you. And that's terrifying. That's just terrifying to me. And he doesn't. In fact, I told Doug, I said, "I'm taking away his body and I'm making him a cape."
Yes. Thank you. Oh my gosh, this is what's going wrong right now. Okay. I mean,
Yep.
so many people are focused on drawing Batman as this super soldier type of guy with all these weapons on him that you can see his visible build. His cape has been reduced to just kind of, well, it's a cape, it's there. His
Well,
ears are too small.
I
He
agree.
doesn't,
And I
he,
agree.
I mean, here's the
Look,
thing. People see him and they think he's a bat. They think they've seen a giant bat.
yeah.
Based on what
Well,
currently?
I think regular people in Gotham, I told Doug, I said, I think regular people in Gotham think he's one of the rogues gallery himself. They don't know he's good or bad, whatever. They just know he's to me, I said, he's the baddest of all of them as far as regular people look at him. There's the Joker and the Scarecrow and all these people, but Batman's the baddest because why? They put a signal in the sky when he's out. And I
Yeah.
said, that's a warning. And that's a warning to everyone. We know it's a call to come and get him for, you got to go see Gordon. But everybody in Gotham goes, "Oh, Jesus, lock your doors. Be good. Don't steal." Right.
You blew my mind. I mean, basically, so people, of course, people don't realize, everybody else
Yep.
doesn't realize what the bat signal is. They think
Right.
it's something, they think it's a warning to criminals. That's
Right.
amazing.
Yeah. And so to me, it's he's loose. and watch out. And at that point, I thought, that's how I'm going to do him. And so every panel with him has to be, he's almost like method acting. There's Bruce Wayne, he's sitting around doing it, but when he's Batman, he never lightens up from this. Even if he's talking to Gordon or whoever, even if it's a good guy, he's always in this position like he's going to do something because that's who he is. So, and Doug says, well, that's a lot to do. Can you do that? And I go, well, I'll give it a shot. You know, the Red Rain stuff was one thing. When I did the monthly, I said, that's what I'm going to do. And I wanted and Doug didn't want me to do the monthly. He wanted to stay in the special stuff. But Denny O'Neil called and said, would you like to do the monthly? We have an opening in it. A long time. Well, I shouldn't say a long time earlier. I had done an Aliens miniseries a few years earlier for Dark Horse. And Doug Wildey, the guy who invented Johnny Quest, was at a show. And he had asked the Dark Horse people if I would come and have a cup of coffee with him. And he was very generous. He really liked what I had done, but it was the best advice ever. And he said, son, you're very, very good, but how long did it take you to do these 4 issues? And I told him whatever it was. And he says, well, the only way you're going to know you're good, son, is how good you are at the end of 2 or 3 years on a monthly book. And that last book has to be better than your first book. The last book has to be at least as good as the first book. And that's where you're going to learn everything. A monthly pressure, the monthly getting it out, will teach you how to draw, teach you how to economize, teach you how to come up with an image, teach you how to think. And he said, anybody can spend a year and do 2 books, but doing 12 in that amount of time, he says, that's how you become professional. And that stayed in my head in 92 or whenever Aliens came out. So when Denny called and said, would you want to do this? It's, 12 issues a year, covers and the whole thing. I jumped on it. And I didn't even ask Doug or anything because Doug was going to be the writer. And I said, yes, I will. And before I could tell Doug, because I was jumping around the house at that moment that I got Batman as a regular thing, and calling my wife, and it just, I couldn't believe it. And then, so I called Doug. Doug was calling me and he was pissed off because he said, what about all of our other things? What about this stuff? And he says, are you going to flake out on me? Are you going to flake out? Because the monthly is a totally different beast. He says, that's the men and the boys thing. He said, monthly, you have to bring it every day. And it may be 7 days a week you got to do it. And all day. And that's the way it's going to be. And for at least a year. Because if you commit to me, I'm writing a year's worth of stories. He says, you're giving me hope that I can write shorts, these one and dones, 2-parters. You were talking about the big book of conspiracies. Doug's, his Batman world was paranoid. And so he says, you're giving me hope. I'm going to write differently. So if you say this, you better mean it, not quit in 5 months. So he read me the Riot Act when I was jumping around and happy. So now I was like worried, like going, well, I've done it before. He says, no. There's doing monthlies and there's doing Batman.
Yeah.
That's different. He says there's a handful of characters. Batman is absolutely one of them. And if you do him monthly, you better mean it. And he threw this in because the rest of your reputation will be, no matter what you did before or what you do after, it's what you do on these, however long you do Batman. That's it. Yeah. That's the way it is. You're on the Yankees now. So you can go play well for the Marlins. It's the Yankees. You're shortstop for the Yankees. You better hit. You better show up. You better field. You better be there. And I hung up the phone and I called my wife and I said, I think I made a mistake. I don't know what to do now, but I'm so happy. But he put my head right. And then for the next 36 issues in a row, I would have done the 4th year. But at that point, if you remember, they were combining all the books to like Detective and Batman and Robin and everything else were all connected. So I was enjoying that 3 years because if you read Batman and you loved it, you didn't have to buy the others. If you read Batman and hated it, you didn't need it to follow the others. It was just us. And Doug was writing one one-shots and two-parters. They were complete, on to the next thing. It was perfect comics for me, absolute perfect. And I was heartbroken because the fourth year was going to be my last year anyway, and we had introduced this little character that was always in the background, and the fourth year was going to be who this guy was and how bad he was and what a great character he was. And because he would be where Bruce was or he'd be where Batman was, and we were going to explain how that happened. Why would he be there?
Who was that character?
He was called, well, we didn't have a name for him. He was just known as the Puppeteer because all you seen him doing was messing with little puppets and just doing little weird things. And you'd never see his face. You just see him doing this little weird thing, a little marionette thing. And you'd see him, Bruce would be at a big function, there he'd be. Batman would be laying out the Joker, he'd be in the background. We had it even where Gordon was on the phone and he's somewhere around. So the fourth season, without saying who he was, we just did it to see if fans would notice. And when we left, I'm still asked that to this day, what about that guy? And I go, well, he's there. But the fourth year they said, no, we got to combine Robin and Detective and as all those characters, they have to be. We got to do that now. It's a reason why those books took probably as long as they did to be reprinted, because there was no reason to have them. The other books were all tied together, so it made sense to put them all in a big book. Ours was only if you wanted it. So one of the nice moments in my career, and it's one of those things that my career takes 10, 20 years to see fruition. But that was one when the first volume came out and it sold out in a month. Of the reprinted. They had never been reprinted really. That they keep coming out, the individual stories keep coming out in a like best Batman villains or best Batman stories or something like that. Those are in there. And at the time I had no idea. They were just so personal. And they were just for us. We would get on the phone and just John Beatty and I and Doug and talk about what we wanted to do. And it would just be 5 minutes of that and half hour just BS and having a good time.
By the way, the chat is going crazy saying we remember the Marionette Man.
Yeah. Okay. The Marionette Man.
They know you.
There is a whole thing that wasn't just thrown out. Maybe one day there were people at DC who were interested in seeing that done. So maybe they'll give us a year and we'll do it. If they did, I would do it. So it would be nice to finish that.
Well, let's. I think now is a good time. I wish we'd rewind a little bit because I want to go back to the point where you're talking about how you see Batman, and you're about to take over. You've got your own ideas. I think you were probably, correct me if I'm wrong, you're probably pretty heavily influenced by Marshall Rogers because he was so important to you as a kid, as a young man. So Marshall Rogers' Batman had the kind of long ears. Of course, yours
absolutely
doubled that.
Marshall was a big influence. I took all of my Marshall books when I got the job, Ethan. I took all of my Rogers books, put them in a case, and didn't look at them because if I looked at them, I couldn't do it. Those are like
because he's so good.
Well, he was just perfect. He was right on the money. So I put them away, and they stayed in my head, and I went under the philosophy of it. So I went back and watched several Orson Welles films and looked at how he created atmosphere. Because I thought, well, if any guy should have made a Batman film, if he could have, it would have been Orson Welles.
The Third Man?
Third Man, Mr. Arcade.
Othello.
Othello.
Mm-hmm.
I loved Macbeth. Just Magnificent Ambersons. Just the way he did the foreground, the midground, and the background.
Kelley, are we related? We're the same guy. We're like...
It sounds the same. Because I realized perspective in comics is good, but comics are so small, it doesn't... that works to an extent, but then it just becomes rectangles and boxes to me. But a strong foreground, strong midground, strong background gave a three-dimensionality that struck me more. And when I would see, that's where I'd see Wrightson do it. He'd always put something real close, something you're to look at in the middle, and then the background. And I went, wow, there's depth to this. I'd see guys do really good stuff with, and he did great perspective, but Jim Steranko was the same way. Something real close up, something in the middle, something in the background. And those books just drew me in. And a lot of guys didn't do that. They thought, well, the way to do it is perspective. And I go, well, perspective's fine. But Mike Golden once told me, he says, you get it generally laid out, and then you want to draw it with your hands. He says, so the buildings each have their own feel. There's like, it's really there. He says, real perspective doesn't exist. It goes like this. The ground goes like this. So some is big, you just get it close. He says, just get it close and then hand do it. He says, and it becomes alive. And if you see any of Mike's stuff, his stuff becomes alive.
Yeah.
And he's absolutely right. He's absolutely right. It's not easier. It's not a shortcut. It's longer to do it. It's easier to do it the other way. I know how to do perspective. It does. I get the points. I put them there, but then I do it all by hand. I just eyeball it. And when I'm doing, particularly Gotham, becomes alive. And Gotham to me is a character more than any other city in any other comic book. Those are cities. They can be whatever. Gotham to me is absolutely a character. It's a living thing. It's a sort of New York. So I put in like, New York was started by the Dutch. So one time I put a windmill in the back. I mean, just nuts stuff, steam trains, whatever. Anything to make atmosphere, anything that makes it like if you go there, you go, yes, weird people from Arkham would live there. These weird villains would live there. They wouldn't be in Metropolis or anywhere else. They'd be here. And it's because the city makes them.
Well, I think now would be a really neat time. Now that we're talking about visuals and everything, I think now would be a really neat time. Could you talk us through a drawing of Batman? Sure. So let's pretend you're starting out now. You're drawing Batman basically for the first time. Your version of Batman. You've got a nice sheet of paper behind you.
Well, I'll tell you what I'll do. The first thing I ever drew, the first thing I was asked to do to show them was the vampire Batman face. And they said, we don't want Batman. We want Batman. But how are you going to do this? And they were very concerned about that. And they went through this back and forth. And I said, well, in the old days, I used to say, I'll just design it on the paper. Don't worry. I'll read the story. I'll get into it. And they said, no, we have to see this because this is different. You're changing him. And everyone knows how he looks and that whole thing. And I said, okay. I see him as a noble vampire, but since he's forcing himself not to drink blood, right? He becomes even more evil. He's more desiccated looking because he's not like Dracula looks good. He's sucking blood all the time. He's full, but not him. And they hadn't thought of that before. They went, okay, that's interesting. I remember Denny saying, God, I haven't even thought of that. I said, well, Doug has it all the way through. He's saying, no, I can't take blood. I can't. He's resisting it the whole time. And I said, so he's got to show the effects of not doing that. So he's got to be truly, truly creepy. So I did one little drawing for him. And I don't know about you, Ethan, but I don't like to give them something to where I have to be stuck to it. What if I change my mind? So I was very loose with it. But the first time I actually had to draw him in a page, that's where I cut loose. It followed what I had. God, I wish I still had that piece because I had to send it into DC. I never saw it again. But I will do that because that's the one everyone asked me about. That everybody.
Nice.
This. Okay, so here, can you see all right? Where I'm?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
All right. So I always kind of start. I always like to kind of start. I'll start with his eyes. Window of the soul, right?
Kelley, can you move the camera closer to the paper? Is there any way you could make the paper bigger on the screen?
Let me see if I can here. Move some of this stuff out of the way. See if I can not give everyone vertigo here for a minute.
They don't mind.
Okay,
They just want to see the drawing.
Okay, let me get this. I'll put it up a little higher here and see if that helps. So I'm trying to recreate whenever I did Red Rain. Okay, is that a little better there?
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay.
Kelley, can you make a noise? Talk.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
All right.
Talk again.
I always start with the eyes, and I like to. I don't really have a place where I start. I'll find a place on a drawing where I like to kind of work, and I'll go from there. And I try to get part of it, whether it's a page or a figure. I get part of it where I really like it, so it forces me to finish it, and I don't start rejecting. So I go in, and a lot of my stuff is all high contrast. And then I work in later all the little details. So here, I like a little sticky eyeball. I know I feel like Bob Ross, but for monsters. So and I always like to get the shape of his head. And this might take a little while, but it's like I said, I get my center point is usually around his eyes. And I use so much ink, I run out of the Sharpies get eaten up pretty quick. I don't know about you, but man, I go through bottles of ink anymore like crazy. An issue takes me 2 bottles, you know? And they make it so thin anymore, I got to leave it out for about a week before it gets thick enough to where I get the lines I like. Yeah, this is what I want. Usually I'm not too good at doing these kind of things, but this is different. This is kind of fun. This is in my wheelhouse, so it's okay. Not too many people. I don't know. It seems like horror in general kind of comes and goes as far as company tastes. Fan taste, it always seems to be there. But companies tend to, depending, they go for it or they don't go for it. So I wouldn't recommend it for people getting into, like, if you do horror, unless it's more independent stuff. But if you can and make it, you always kind of they'll always go, yeah, we'll hire you because you can draw a monster guy, It's a weird thing. All right. Yeah, now it's starting to take a little shape. And then with Vampire Batman, it's a little more skull. He's there. He's not dead. But he's clearly missing some meals. And then I like getting the best part of heavy blacks is you can use it to point, like I said, to where you want people to look and get across a nice sense of the character here. Go. Is this big enough you can see okay? There we go. All right. Now, once this cowl's in place, it starts becoming Batman. For me, the cowl makes it Batman. Okay, now I get my little pen to do little details here. And that will make it all come together very well. There we go. And because he's kind of skeletal, I always give him like his neck vertebrae always kind of stick out too.
Kelley, talk again. My camera came up.
Okay. No, I always add like his vertebrae sticking out, more skeletal. You know, all this stuff. You can't really say this to an editor on the phone because they visualize something so awful. They can't see selling it. You know, they can't see how's that going to sell. So I would always say he would look hungry. That they could understand. I couldn't say he would look like, you know, this. If I described it, other people who liked horror stuff, they would go, yeah, that sounds great. But you know, I couldn't really approach Denny and say that because Denny, you know, he had visions of Batman like a normal guy. Even, and if he's a vampire, basically all he'd have are long teeth. You know, that was the extent of the look. So I knew a lot of the success of this book would be, you know, when you watch a movie and at the end, instead of a ghost, it's actually a guy pretending to be a ghost. That was always a big cheat. So I figured when I would do this, he has to look truly monstrous. And that wasn't really described in the story. It was just he's a vampire. So I figured, well, if I make him monstrous and give him big wings and everything, then people know, yeah, that's real. That's a body change, you know? And there's no coming back from that. And Doug wrote it that there was no coming back. Yeah, I love the big. Actually, it's the neck vertebrae, the spine sticking out is what always creeped me out. And he became more of a monster that way. So, this kind of stuff. God, this is strange to actually talk about it. I haven't really discussed it like that before. I guess that's a good part about doing an interview. Is it kind of makes me think about it a little more in depth. And I gave him lots of stringy sinews because, you know, he's basically bones with a bag of skin. And then obviously the teeth, which a lot of the emotion is in his mouth. Not just a grimace, but it should be that it goes to that's the thing that's really upsetting about him. And then I always used to tell the color his teeth yellow. That's a lot more frightening to me, you know. I don't typically think of color too much, other than I'm a really strong primary palette. Um, not a lot of overproduction. I like the blacks to be left as black as possible because I think black is a color. And comics to me are always very graphic. So the high contrast graphic stuff, it screams comics to me.
Up, talk again. I just showed up. Sorry.
Okay.
I'm being
No,
quiet, by the way, just so that people can watch you draw. Just so you know, that's why I'm being silent.
no, that's okay. That's okay. Yeah, see, then what happens here is it's the little details to me that always bring out these big solid blacks are brought out by the littler, smaller details. Give you something, once you get the image in your face like this and in your head, then when you investigate the drawing a little bit more, there's all these little details to kind of tell the story a little bit about this guy. That's probably true in a lot of stuff. Get these last little things in. I'm always big on the last little things. So then just to pull it out a little bit. Yeah. Because when you're doing a black image on a big white board like this, you got to show all the lights and dark choices don't really come out unless you, oddly enough, get the background filled in. And then it comes out. That's where I probably waste most of my ink, is doing all these, filling in the blacks and the backgrounds. I could never have an assistant because they used to get mad. Filling in the blacks was a very arduous journey on my stuff, you know? And actually, I enjoyed doing it. I never wanted an assistant. It's kind of the magic of it all coming together, you know? That's what I dug. So there you go. Pretty violent drawing. There you go.
That is beautiful. The chat was worshiping you through the whole thing.
Okay.
I was trying my best to just be quiet.
No, look, normally, I don't know about you. Normally, I work. The only place I really draw, Ethan, is in my studio.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really go anywhere and draw. I don't carry notebooks around. I don't. My kids didn't even know I drew comics for a living until they were like 12 or 13. Because I'd only do it in my studio. And then I was, telling them to mow the lawn and bring in the trash and get good grades all the other times. So I always wondered what they said to their teachers. Like, poor mom has to work all the time and dad just sits at home watching movies in his studio or in his, what they called it, a movie room.
That's what they all think, isn't it? They all think we can sit around watching movies.
Well, I have to admit, I work with, I turn on music and turn on the television. I have everything going when I'm working.
Mm-hmm.
And I can pay a little bit of attention to a movie, listen to a part of a song. Well, it's like a white noise, so I stay focused on what I'm doing. So I guess why I don't draw too much when I'm outside of the studio is I don't have all those things with me. It isn't I need paper and pencil and all that. I don't have all the white noise. It's partly like if you run a film while you're working, it's a timing device. By the time this movie's over, I'll have this much of the page done, kind of thinking. Other times it's just so you're not alone in a giant house while you're working.
Yeah, to me, it just puts me in a trance. I need to have
Yeah.
something loud in my ears to zone out.
Yep. And partly the reason I don't draw too much when I'm not in here is so it refreshes me when I come. When I go into my studio, it's work. I'm like ready to go. That's my like a football player doesn't go home and tackle his wife, or maybe he does, but you know what I mean. He does it on the field, and that's where I go. I go, that's the field, and so I'll work. And I always tell people that's how you stay refreshed. That's how you're not tired of doing it, because it's just as important when you're not doing it to not be doing it. And when you are doing it, like most of my drawing is done. I'll read what the script says the day before I do it, and I'll think about it. After a day's work, I'll read the script, go have dinner, go do whatever, think about it. So when I sit down the next day, it's mostly drawn already. I've already got the ideas. I only like to use reference when I absolutely have to, because most of it I want it to come out of my head. That's where a style comes from. Style comes from you solving your own problems. And I have influences, but that's why I said I put Marshall away, because he was going to solve all my problems, not I wasn't going to get to. So I sat down and like for the cape, I remember taking I went and bought a big black sheet, and I wet it down and hung it over some chairs outside. And that's where Batman's cape, all these folds start coming in. And because it was in direct sunlight, it was all wet and it was black, it made a shit. And that's about the most I've ever done. And at that point, it was wonderful, just wonderful shape.
Outstanding. It's making your own photo reference. It also helps that most of the books that you work on are completely imaginary and concocted worlds. I mean, Micronauts, and then to Swamp Thing, and then to, Batman and Sandman. These are all worlds that you can build out of your head. You don't have to draw Manhattan. Like if you were working on Spider-Man, what would you do? Would you?
Well, I did. If I had to do that, then you do. Then you actually, I would go, like I go around town and I take a lot of pictures when I have to do straight stuff. And I'll take a lot of pictures and just kind of walk around and get used to it and see how it works.
How boring for you. That's not what I want you to do. Like as a fan of your work.
I don't. And part of it is I'm lazy. So I go, well, I kind of know what things look like, and I'll do it from memory, right? Or I'll do it from invention. And then I start thinking more logically, thinking, well, when I read comics, did I really give a crap about the buildings? Unless somebody was climbing on or going through it, I was looking at the characters and that kind of stuff. And so that part takes over. And to overcompensate for not delivering in that end is where you do all the other things that people will look at.
I think you're right. So, at this point now, I have to skip over like at least 15 years of your career, because the chat is blown up. People want to ask you questions, and I want to get to where we are right now. You mentioned earlier when you and I were talking privately, someone who has meant a lot to you your entire life, your entire career as an artist, and presumably, you were friends with him. I was friends with him.
Yeah.
The late great Bernie Wrightson.
Yes.
He passed on last year.
Yeah, earlier this year in March.
And left you, left something in your hands to complete. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, he had been doing a series, Frankenstein, obviously Frankenstein, for IDW, and he reached a point where he knew he wasn't going to be able to do it, so he had asked if I would finish. He had drawn a few pages. He had laid out quite a bit of it, designed it, and he had simply, said, I can't think of someone else I would rather do this that could do it. And I didn't, you can't really say no at that point. Hearing that was heartbreaking because I knew, if someone's going to stop or retire, like he said, probably we all face that. It's just, I see myself always, Ethan, as a fan, so much more than a pro, that it's still difficult for me to accept the pro side of this, to be seen that way or accepted that way, or have people say anything really nice that way, because I still see myself as very lucky to get this job. So I had a front row seat to meet all the people I wanted to meet and hear all the stories and stuff. So when he did that, there I was 12 years old again, looking at Swamp Thing #2 when, and I thought, I absolutely will do it. And the sad part was, lost Len Wein this year. So I was doing a Swamp Thing miniseries at the same time. And Len was only able to complete the first story. We had talked out the others, but he just became too ill to work. So DC had asked if I would finish his last story, the last issue. And right as soon as I was done to that, I jumped on to finishing Bernie's last story for Frankenstein. And let me tell you, you never cannot not learn. Let me get you something here, and I'll see if it shows up. It's some of Bernie's designs.
Gee whiz. Yeah, well, yes, please.
Okay, give me 1 second, and I'll go get it. I didn't even think about it. Just 1 second.
I mean, this has to be the greatest guest that we've ever had. Am I right? This is just fantastic. We're getting a show and tell and behind the scenes stuff. Like, I think this is kind of setting the mold for all future guest chats, frankly. It's like, come on my show, draw, show us what you're working on, or GTFO. Yeah.
Okay. All right. This is pretty remarkable. Bernie, it's kind of maybe hard to see here, but Bernie would lay out on this, if you can see here, a little layout, and all this writing was what was going to happen. And it starts, you can see something finished here. This is Bernie off of one of those little designs, and this he got about halfway through, and then he couldn't do it. And it's all, he was setting himself up for all this tonal stuff. And like this is beautiful. These are some of his finished pencils. They're just beautiful. I'm glad I get to show these. Right. You can see. Mm-hmm. Gorgeous. This is a guy who never lost a step.
What an honor to be carrying on this legacy, to get a chance to finish. I mean, is the stuff that you're showing us actually going to see print?
Yes. I'm finishing as best I can. Let's see, there's something so you can, I got it here. There's so much, absolutely so much thinking in his work that, like I said, you don't ever stop learning. And I'm glad when I go through this, well, like I said, it's these beautiful finished pencils of his. Just lovely, just incredible stuff.
I feel like crying, honestly.
I just never stopped. I think I just hope that when I reach that age or whatever, I can produce at that level.
The chat is saying, "We know you can do it, Kelley. We know you can do it." They're cheering you on.
I'm gonna try. His skills are beyond. He never stopped learning. He never stopped doing it. You know, so it makes you think. Well, Bernie had always told me, "You're either in or you're out," and that the last 5 or 10% of a drawing is what makes the whole drawing. So you can start with all this energy, you can get all the way through it, but you got to finish as strong, if not stronger, than when you finish. And I would say that's true. I mean, clearly he got that from experience, but that's the truth of the matter. He never stopped. As he told me, he was always thinking about it. And a lot of his drawing, you know, very similar to what you were saying. He had a lot of stuff going on in his studio, television on, radio on, whatever. Probably you're right. I think I'd never thought of it that way, but you put yourself in a trance when you do it. Bernie doesn't sketch in this, by the way. It doesn't really show up. It's all just drawing. He doesn't, it's just drawing. So there's no figure under drawing, no laying out, nothing. Just it was in his head, it goes on paper. Maybe that's just the way you're born, you know? I don't know. I would like to think I still scratch around a lot, but I did understand when he said that you think about it a lot, and all the stuff comes out of there. He had really perfected this style of his, I think, through the fact that it was a force of will. Everyone else was doing superheroes. DC created a book so they could have him in Swamp Thing. That I can't really think of too many other guys that were outside of this. You know, he didn't do capes and heroes. He had such a unique thing that they had to have him, so they invented a book. And that's that's as incredible a compliment as I can imagine. You know, I told him that once, and he just laughed about that. You know, he just said, "Oh, you're overrating me." And I went, "I can't think of another guy." I know there's people that give books to, but to invent a genre, pretty amazing.
He was worth it. You have to. I mean, it's like building an arena for an Elvis performance. You're going to do it.
Yeah,
Elvis.
Well, it is. Look, he was a good person too, and I think what I always like to think about him was that he, and you knew him, so he was a guy who was just really sweet. He was genuinely flattered if you told him you liked his stuff.
Every time, huh? Isn't that true?
He would always go, "Oh man, really?" And I would go, "He means that." I mean, but he was a guy who he didn't have a lot of online presence because he didn't know if he really deserved it. You know, all the accolades. I mean, I remember telling him. I told him once. I said, "You just have to let me do this," and I went down the whole litany of what he meant to me, just as a fan, not drawing or anything, just as a fan, that he had become a part of my childhood, and that, you know, other kids' heroes were astronauts and ball players. He was mine. So my parents, it's funny, they used to hear me rattle on about Bernie Wrightson in the backseat of their station wagon. God knows how many years, where I would, you know, my kids thought he was a relative of ours just because I would talk about him in terms of how he did things so much. So they didn't, when they were very little. And I would tell people about, you know, because I would get animated about it. It isn't just I liked his work. I think what he did was he showed everyone you create a world. No matter what character you're doing, you have to believe that world, and then you put the character in it. He always used to say, "Oh, you know, that's not true." I go, "It is true, because you can see it in your work." You know, you can see that there. You could take Swamp Thing out of the panels. It's still a Swamp Thing comic. It wasn't Tarzan. That's a lot of commitment. As an artist, that's a lot of commitment. That's no slouching.
So when do you think Frankenstein is going to be finished? Are you on a deadline, or are they just saying?
They would like it. I'm doing pretty well on it right now. I've got all but a few pages left to get all the penciling done. For me, Ethan, the inking is where the fun is. So I'm really anxious to get to that point. I've went over the originals. I went over his finishes because I don't want to lay down lines like I do. I want to lay them down like he did. And sometimes you want to see if he pulls the line or pushes it, where he dry brushes. He makes a lot of organic decisions on the page. So that part of it, I'm really excited to do. Let's see if I can find some more of it. But that's kind of, that's kind of the fun part of this is, excuse me, I'm just plugging in the thing here. The fun part is you get to see someone at that level. It's kind of like an acoustic performance, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Stripped down from everything. You get to see how the guy puts it together. And Bernie wasn't a guy who liked to draw in front of people too much. Not to keep it private, but when he was working, he didn't want to be distracted. So when I came to this, I didn't really have discussions with him over that. Mostly it was what we liked. We both really enjoyed Julia Child cooking shows, oddly enough. I know. He loved Julia Child cooking shows. And that only came out that he had asked me, well, what do you watch? And I said, well, clearly, all kinds of things. I said, right now I'm watching The Best of Julia Child. This was about 5 or 6 years ago. And he jumped out of his chair saying, so am I. He said, did someone tell you I'm doing that? And I said, no, it's just watching a cooking show is kind of fun. It's creative. It's something that I think is just kind of fun to watch people do stuff. So that
Did you both cook? I mean, did he cook? Did you cook?
I don't know if he did. I do.
Mm-hmm.
Matt Wagner once said cooking is something creative that if it doesn't come out right, everybody doesn't know, right? It's just you and your family. The whole world doesn't see. So, but it allowed him to be creative. There's probably something to that. But when I lived by myself and I was drawing comics, I had to cook.
Yeah. What do you think when you're finished Frankenstein and IDW is publishing it? I can't believe they're that lucky. What do you hope? What do you wish Bernie Wrightson would say to you if he could see it completed?
Well, beyond just hoping I don't, that you go into it knowing there is what he did. There's what he did, and then what you can do. Just that it honored the spirit of the story he was trying to tell. Bernie was a very generous guy. He would never say anything negative at all. He wasn't that kind of a guy. But just that he would try to, you just try to create that same vibe that he was trying to get. That's why when I told him I would do it, I said I just need, any of the materials. I don't want to see scans. I needed to physically touch it, and physically see it. And like I said, one of the remarkable things was when I got these things, there's no underdrawing. It's just drawing. It's like he sat down and drew it. So I can't do that, but I can, I can at least, I've walked in that world a long time. It's influenced me in sense, like you said, with Batman, quite a bit, to bring that kind of sense of mystery, So, and he was a very big fan of my take on Batman. And I thought he was just being very kind to me, and he just had said no. And he starts talking about specific issues. He says, you think in ways that I don't, and there's a lot of stuff here. And he was asking me this, and I had to just stop him because I can't. We're not peers. It's like he's who he is, and I listen. And I get. So it took me a while to get used to that. But he used to say, he says, no, we're fellow travelers in this. And I just was wondering how, I'm interested. I'm just curious. So there was that aspect to him that was very disarming, because Ethan, when you go away and you look at his work, if you look at Frankenstein or anything he's done, you go, Lord, how did one person achieve this? And he transcended being a comic book artist and became a great American illustrator. You have to rate to get a obituary in the New York Times, as a great American illustrator.
Yep.
So you forget that as best you can and just hope that he says, thank you very much. You did what you could do. No one's gonna hopefully compare me to him that way. Just know that I'm trying to at least finish that last thing. I would like, as with Len, a new book of theirs material comes out, that's the best thing I can give them. It's a thank you for getting me into this.
Mm-hmm.
It's just very strange.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I cut you off.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say we're hogging up your time, and I want to definitely get some questions from
go ahead.
Fans. Do you mind?
Go ahead. No, as many as you want.
Okay, guys, you could start the questions coming through here. I don't want to keep you longer than like 2 hours if you've got a family, and so far it's been an hour and 45, and you're so generous, and I really appreciate it.
Go ahead. Don't feel you have to rush.
Okay. Rod Line says, can you please thank Mr. Jones for sharing his thoughts and talents? His Micronauts work was really influential to me. So that's a nice thing.
Thank you.
Clark Nichols asked something interesting. I mean, I wouldn't have thought to ask you this. I wonder if Kelley likes Gundam.
You mean the Japanese anime?
I'm picturing Robotech kind of thing.
Yeah, I remember years ago, I liked some of the stuff I had seen. It wasn't in animated. It wasn't like on cartoons or anything. A friend of mine worked at a comic book store, and this is the early 80s, and they were getting these big slicks of the animated stuff, but all broken down like frame by frame. And I remember those that I liked. And I remember Gundam then. I think it was a robot character or something like that. But I appreciated that stuff then. Spaceship Yamato and stuff like that I enjoyed.
Thomas Matthew Byrne asks, Kelley, how do you feel about working on books such as Dark Joker: The Wild compared to the regular Batman series?
Well, I enjoy those because since nobody's done them, it's like new territory. So I can take a lot of things that are in my head that I always wanted to do that wouldn't fit in a regular straight Batman and go do that. It's always nice to be asked to take something that requires your imagination, more so than just interpreting a script or something, but something that's brand new territory that has to retain the feel of it. So Dark Joker was a lot of fun. Again, a book that was written for other people, and for whatever reason they couldn't do it, so they had asked me. I had a break in my schedule, and they asked if I would do it, and I said, "You can't say no."
What do you think of DC's current metal, Dark Knights? Have you read it?
I've seen what I've seen so far. I've liked quite a bit. I thought it was actually one of the better of the event things in a long time. It was pretty impressive. So far so good. I mean, just as that fan part of me, I enjoyed it.
We've got a super chat from Burgundy Ghost. Thank you, Burgundy Ghost. And he's been waiting. I believe he's been waiting to ask you this question. He says, I was enthralled by the Marionette Man and couldn't wait to find him in each issue of Batman. Did Marionette Man inspire Midnight in Gotham after Midnight?
No, that was a completely separate thing. That was inspired by Steve Niles was very taken with the Lon Chaney Sr. film that was lost, London After Midnight. And so that's what his inspiration was. The Marionette Man is a guy, like I said, he goes back. He's involved with Bruce in some way, and Batman, and he knows everything, what's going on. And clearly, look, the mystery is, if he's there where some action's happening, he knew it was happening. Did he make it happen? Did he organize it some way to drive this story to that last year? And that's what we were doing. So there's a lot of, it was, Doug always said the detective part of Batman he wanted to bring back, the Sherlock Holmes thing. So he would put clues in leading to something. And that was part of it.
Nostalgia and criticism. Thank you for the super chat. Not a question, but just tell him on my behalf that I appreciate everything he is doing. I hope he puts that drawing up for auction on eBay.
I was going to send it to you, Ethan.
Yeah, okay. So be quiet, nostalgia and criticism. It's coming my way.
I was going to say, there you go. It's part of for your show, right? Yeah.
He says best live stream so far. Thank you, Mr. Jones. And that's they've a lot of these guys have watched all of them, and I do agree this was really good. Emily, thank you for the super chat. She says, can you talk about some of the BTS process for planning events like Contagion behind the scenes? I guess it's my favorite Batman event after No Man's Land.
Well, I think at the time, one of the guys had read the Hot Zone book, and that was about a real description of the Marburg Ebola viruses that were getting loose. And I believe it was Jim Ballant, the artist on Catwoman, who had said, well, we should do this thing within where a disease rips through Gotham. And it really just started from there. I only did one issue of it with Poison Ivy. I was always, like I said, always kind of resistant of being involved in this. One of the few times I went along with it because I was friends with Jim and I liked the idea. And I only had to be committed one issue. So at that point, got him pretty awful on those years because I was either just doing covers and my own thing, and what they were doing in the rest of Batman universe, I was only aware of when they said you have to reference something or drop a line in it. But Doug and I only did our own books, so I was kind of on a desert island.
Rad Draw Wheel asks, Kelley, what are your favorite movie monsters?
Frankenstein. I love Karloff's Frankenstein. I love Rodan. Big Rodan fan. Creature of the Black Lagoon, obviously that's a no-brainer. I really like the Demon in Curse of the Demon. That demon gets to me. Robbie the Robot's my favorite robot. I'm sure there's a million others, but those come to mind immediately.
They used that robot quite a bit. I saw him turn up in a Twilight Zone and
yeah,
two Twilight Zones.
Yeah, I saw where they just auctioned him recently. Turner Classic Movies just auctioned him, and we should have went in together and got it.
I would have loved to. I'd share him.
Yeah.
I'd share him with you.
Yeah.
Stinkfinger wants to know, does he play a musical instrument? And if so, can you two jam online sometime?
Well, a long time ago, I played the piano for about 2 years, but I wanted to draw so much, the practice time was eating into it. And I love playing. I wish I could go back and not have let my parents talk them into letting me quit, because I loved playing it.
All right. What Maranya Valkonen says, trusty sidekick and I want to know, what are Kelley's preferred inking tools?
I'm pretty simple. I use number 2 Winsor Newton. I use a 107, 102 Crowquill tip points, and this.
And your thumbprint.
Yeah, I'm mushing all the way, spreading around. But I keep it along those lines. I don't really get too wild on it because I want a certain consistency and I want to make those things. I in fact like old brushes that I've worn out because you can get different dry brush effects. Some are great for clouds, some are great for shadows. Um, I kind of like seeing what the ink will do on rough paper. I know a lot of guys who have went digital. A lot of guys work on and that's fine. I would be afraid to lose that physical contact where I can make something happen. I want happy accidents all the time.
I'm with
I'm
you
very
there.
messy. I'm
Yeah.
very messy.
Hey, Jeff Habib asks, besides Doug Mensch, who was your favorite writer to work with?
Well, see, that's like what's your favorite son? What's your favorite daughter? You can't do that. I will say favorite stories. I certainly I enjoyed very much working with Neil and very much working with Mike Barron. Uh, Barron's Dead Man was completely uh, different in the actual scripts. So I get a lot of credit for changing him, but Mike wrote him as a very tortured character, so it worked together. I very much enjoyed working with Steve Niles. Uh, he's extremely visual. His scripts almost draw themselves. Um, I would say that when I worked with Steve Siegel on the Crusades, it would take me. I would always, when the script would come, it would take me a day. I would know I'd have to work the next day because I would sit down and just read them. They were almost literary. You know, they were beautifully written. His characters all spoke in such different voices. So I've been very lucky that I've gotten to work with who I've gotten to work with because Len Wein understood comics so well that it was so shorthand. It was right to the point. It was very visual and right to the point. There was no extraneous stuff. So I always look at it as if there's a thing that I look for in a script, uh, it's how much do I get to do that helps illuminate what they're trying to say. And if I have that, it's a terrific thing. But I'd have to say I've been pretty lucky on all my major stuff. All the writers were, uh, well, they understood comics. They were easy. You could call them up, they'd make changes. They'd call them up, they would ask you what you want. They were very open to that, every single one of them. Nobody said, this is how it's got to be. And once you draw like I do, or you do what I do, I think they kind of come there expecting that, you know? So, I maybe reputation helps that, you know, to a certain extent. When people come, they will be much more open to something you do that's different. I think what's happened for me is Doug Mensch once told me, he says, well, you're always going to have to overcome people's initial shock of what you do because it's different and it's going to set them back a little bit and it's going to take them a while to get used to it. He says, so don't be put off by that. And I never was. I figured that's part of the territory. If you're going to make Batman's ears foot and a half longer, you're gonna you get what you get, and that's totally fair. But the best reaction I've had, it comes from editors that will initially say, I didn't like what you did. Then I looked at it again and started to like what you did. Now it's the only way I see it. And then and I've been fortunate with that. There's nothing better, Ethan, you know, than an artist or as a fan who changes their mind about you. You know, they'll say, I don't like it. Hey, I really do now. That's, you live for that. You know, that's you thank God they took the time to look and see that you weren't just hacking it out. You were really thinking about it.
Yeah. The Burgundy Ghost, thank you for another super chat. Last question. Ethan, you have GL Rebirth as your quote known cover. I consider Batman 497 as Kelley's known cover.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
I hated it when I did it. It wasn't one, the covers I was doing, I now I look at it, but again, I was so close to these things. When I was doing the run of covers, they were working so fast on them, they didn't really know what was in them. So they would just say, Batman's in a sewer. Batman's fighting whoever, you know, whatever, that it was very loose. So I just had to draw a cover. When it came to that one, they knew that was a pretty big cover. So they said, all right, Bane is breaking his back, and they told me several ways that it didn't sound it. They didn't look dramatic to me. And I said, well, how about if he's breaking his back like you know, at that time, if you remember, there were a lot of baseball players breaking bats over their knees. So I thought, you know, that's kind of funny, a bat over a knee. I'll do that. And it was as simple as that, you know. And I drew a sketch for it, and I turned it in thinking they would reject it. And I was working without being approved that way. I would just draw covers, ink them, turn them in. This one was going through a lot of eyes on it. And I thought, well, this is the one they'll reject. And they didn't. And it kept going along. And then finally I just did it. And I thought, wow, I was underwhelmed when I did it. It wasn't until 10 years later that I looked at it and went, that's pretty good. You know, that looks like it hurts.
That was a great cover. You should have known that right away.
Yeah, but you know,
really good.
Ethan, sometimes do you get pretty close to something, you obsess too much? I have a great fear of boredom. So I got to draw and get on to the next thing. If I have to spend more time on something, either fidgeting with it, redoing, tweaking, or whatever, I always think it's like a Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox. It starts getting weaker and weaker. So when I was doing these things a couple of times over, I was so tired of it that I couldn't wait to get it in the box and ship it off to him and then go on to what I was doing. My whole life has been fear of boredom. My whole career has been how to avoid another day of a real job, you know? So, I've never understood guys who can spend days and days and days on a page. I'd go, God, I would pull my hair out. If it takes longer than a day, I'm doing something wrong. But then again, I don't get up and walk around when I'm working. When I sit down to work, it's a solid, however long, 6, 8, 9 hours on that page. It's pure focus, you know?
So this is interesting. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. Walter Bonham, thanks for the super chat. He says there are so many interesting things about his room. Could he give us a quick tour? Okay. And everyone's saying, oh, yes, please tour.
Okay, well, let's see what I can show you here. All right. Let's see if take this down. I have my posters from when I was a kid. Right? Like, can you see that pretty good?
Oh, yeah.
I had these on my wall when I was 12, 13. All these things here. Of course, Frankenstein. This old beer thing that I loved that used to be at my parents' house. I've never gotten tired of it. And then my famous ceiling of movie posters.
Are those originals?
Yep. I got those years ago at when you go to all the comic shows and stuff. In the old days, they used to sell a lot of these things. Okay. Still looking at the ceiling here. Stanley Kubrick, who always tells me to work harder. And of course, there's Frankenstein. All the toys. All these silly toys and stuff. Endless amounts of movies.
VHS.
Oh, I still have VHF. All my DVD. These are just like a smattering of them. All the movie soundtracks. There's Robbie going off. I still have my old records. Yeah, see? Still got the old records. Yeah, all the movies and stuff go way back here. Let's see if you can see. There we go. See, I got tons of movies. Tons of old stuff. All the toys and weird crap. You know, it's like a 12-year-old's room, actually, who has money. That's what this is.
That's my room, too.
Yeah.
My basement is like this.
Yeah, lots of crap. Then my attic. See, I have the attic here. Yeah, see, Frankenstein again is in the attic. Keep lots of stuff and crap in the attic. Kind of, I don't know how exciting this is, but I got a brain. Everyone should have a brain.
They're excited by it.
Okay. I have no idea if this is interesting. Let's see, what else do I got here?
Somebody wants to know, Nostalgia and Criticism, thanks for the super chat. What is your favorite Godzilla movie?
Probably Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, because it has Rodan, Godzilla, has the Thing in it. I love when the monsters are cursing at each other. I really love when they're guilted when the little Mothra goes and fights Ghidorah by himself, and they have to deal with it and go, all right, and then they go in and take him on. I love that. I do. I mean, it works. My favorite probably of those kinds is War of the Gargantuas. That's my favorite. Frankenstein Conquered the World. But man, I'll tell you, I will stop everything to watch just for that scene where they're shamed by that little worm going to fight Ghidorah. No movie, very rarely does a movie do that, where you're going, I know this is absurd, but as a kid it worked, and as an adult, that completely works. I love those things. I don't know if anyone remembers that, but that's what I always dug that.
What hero have you never worked on? What character, I should just say, that you need to work on?
Well, they would never let me, but I would love Superman.
I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah.
I knew you were going to say that. Now, have you ever drawn Superman?
I've not even drawn him in the background of anything. And I begged him and begged him. I had one editor, he's not there anymore, Michael Seglain, if you remember.
Yeah.
Okay, Mike Seglain was fabulous setter. He's now he went to Disney and edits for them. I do these let's see, where do I got one here? Yeah, I've been doing on the side, these little illustrated novels for him. So he's still around. Let's see if I find an illustration in here. But yeah, stuff like this.
It's beautiful.
They're Haunted Mansion novels for kids. And anyway, I do those. He had, Michael Seglain had said, he asked me the same question. And he said, would you like to do Superman? Because you're always talking about him. I said, I'd love to. He says, well, what do you have in mind? I said, I have no idea, but I want to do, if you remember in Batman, I used to do little chapter breaks where I'd have Batman on a lamppost or some kind of symbolic image. And I said, I just always want to do Batman or Superman, where the chapter breaks would him be doing, not connected to the story, but some little good deed. I always loved when he took the cat out of the tree in that first film. Just little, that's, to me, Superman would be doing lots of little things as well as saving the universe like he always does. And I just said I would love a story where it's all those little things, and the big story would take a background. That would be the background. Yeah, it's going on. He's fighting whoever. But on his way to stuff, he's Superman. He goes incredibly quick. He would see some little thing that needs doing. Somebody's out of gas in Utah, in the middle of nowhere. There's some other maybe minor thing going on. But he would do all these things, showing that he would have a connection with regular people. That was one-on-one, like a really good cop or something. And then he goes and fights Steppenwolf. I don't know. That thing. And so, as the bane of my career is, we get right up to that point, and then he says, I got to quit. I'm leaving DC. So that will never see the light of day. But it was a cute thing. He was a huge Superman fan, so he was going to let me do it.
Well, you could do that. DC would let you do that.
I don't know. I would, if I probably could do anything, it would be that would be it, is Superman. Mm-hmm. Just because I think probably no one could see me doing it. I don't see it. I wouldn't see it as a dark thing. It would be more very light, very optimistic, very joyous.
What is your work? What's your work and your glory right now? If you were to pass on tomorrow, What would you want people to remember you for in terms of comics?
Just in terms of comics, I would probably say not saying it's my best work or anything like that. Probably the first Dead Man, because that was the fruition of all that stuff that was in me. And I was ready to quit comics then because it just wasn't getting out. I had a job, I could keep working. But there was something very unfulfilling when I would look at the stuff and it wasn't what was in my head. And I would look at it, and what made it worse, Ethan, was people complimenting me and say, we love what you're doing. And I was feeling more and more despair over that. It would have been better if they said, we hate what you're doing. So when they let me go to go do or when I left Marvel and went to DC, I wasn't even hired to do horror. That just fell in my lap. And I say horror not because I like to draw monsters and stuff, but that's where a lot of emotion can come out. A lot of different kind of storytelling is required in a horror story. I always actually like to do less gore and stuff. I like to lead up to it to have that one image. And if it takes several pages, so be it. But I love the pace and the build up and the tension, and it forces better drawing out of me. It forces more interesting thinking. And what I mean by that is later on when I did Batman, there was a issue called The Ogre and the Ape. So there was just a standard shot, and Doug says this guy kills someone else by plugging in an electric socket and it electrocutes him. And that should have been easy to do, but it bothered me that it was easy to do. So I was trying to think, what's a different angle? What's a different angle? And so it came to me out of frustration. The angle was from inside the socket as the plug's coming at it. And it would just have two slots to draw, it'd be black with the two slots. And I had to figure out how to get it to look like someone was plugging in a plug. It's a little panel. Nobody will ever remember it. I had so much joy when that came out that it worked. I think only one guy ever noticed it. But that's what I was missing before Dead Man, was those moments where you could, Marvel would have removed that back then. They'd have just said, that doesn't make sense. That's distracting. Nobody, if there's a great thing with DC then as is now, is they just let that stuff go. Okay, go. That was acceptable. So there's those moments, and Dead Man was just filled with those. And again, when I look at it, I remember that summer and fall I was left alone to do it. So it's probably a personal nostalgia. Batman the monthly was a real, well, you've done monthly, you know what it is. The rest of the world goes away, and it's just that. It's the drawing board every day. But that was a different thing. There was probably an issue of Gotham After Midnight, the third issue with Clayface, where Steve Niles said Batman gets in a robot and fights a giant Clayface. And it's absurd. I mean, it's absurd. But I had an absolute blast, and it worked. When it was done, it was one of the better issues. Because I had to come up with a different robot. I didn't want one with arms and legs, and I didn't want one that looked Japanese. It was just, he's in a ball, and it's on a tube that leads to another little ball and rolls around. It was just very weird Batman stuff. So those are the things that I don't mean that to be purposely eccentric. It's just there's those wonderful moments of creation where I never would have thought of doing that. So it wouldn't be probably one project. I would start picking out all these oddball panels that just were delightful. They were old comics to me, when you look at those old 40s and 50s comics, these odd things. So that would probably be stuff like that.
What do you think about everybody saying, why hasn't he drawn Doctor Strange yet?
They haven't asked me.
But you would. I mean, that's obviously, when someone said that, I said, oh my God. Yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
Would you do it?
I have a million ideas for that. I mean, there's things that I always felt with Doctor Strange that I could take advantage of
a lot of the weird stuff I do, not so much in the weird way I present it, but in how I actually put stuff together to get across a different, like a real, a magic effect. I think the distortion, I look for distortion in my own work. I look, like if it's a lead guitar, I want feedback. And that's what I would do, is look for a lot of moments in there to create not just a magical effect, but that magic is weird. That when Dicko touched on that and did a beautiful job, that it's weird. And not that other people haven't done it, but I always saw where he was as kind of moving around all the time, not from him making it, it would just be doing stuff. It would be very different. In his little sanctum sanctorum, it would be an upsetting place.
CB Sobolski, can you hear us? Yeah, you need to get Kelley on a Doctor Strange book. I can't believe that hasn't happened yet. It just seems so damn obvious to me. So, well, listen, I want to thank you so much, Kelley. The chat wants to thank you. This has been a joy, I think, for people who really want to get inside comics and understand your career and where your heart is and where your mind goes. Thank you so much for spending 2 hours and 15 minutes pouring out your heart and making an awful lot of people happy. The chat has been full this entire time, and everybody was very grateful to meet you.
Well, thank you for even asking. I hadn't even thought of it. I don't usually do these things. I don't know why I don't. It doesn't come up, and nobody asks, so I don't, and I'm not savvy enough to do this. I don't know. I don't come from a place where I think people are interested in me. I'm more interested in like what you do or what other. I'm interested in that myself. So once I get over the fear of I'll bore people, then it's okay. So I enjoyed
this was anything but boring. Anything but boring. This was absolutely wonderful. Everybody was riveted. Thank you so much. We'll return you to your family. We've kept you in this room for a long time. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who watched. Thank you for the super chats. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the comments. This is going to be available to rewatch in about 30 minutes. It'll post on my channel. And, tell a friend. I mean, everybody needs to see this, frankly, especially the drawing part. That was the best. Kelley, my friend, have a great night. And Merry Christmas, by the way.
Merry Christmas to you too and everyone else. Thank you very much.
All right. Good night.
All right.